Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is Friday, March 16th, and I'm doing a video blog today on Mars entering Capricorn tomorrow. We're also going to talk about Anaretic degrees. What are they? How do they work? We're going to talk about planetary exaltations. So these are three pretty important topics that I get asked about quite a bit from readers and students. Let's define them briefly. The reason I'm looking at these three topics today is because the planet Mars is culminating in the final degree of Sagittarius today and will change into Capricorn tomorrow, where it will be exalted. So that gives us three different topics to talk about. One is the meaning of Mars in Capricorn. Generally speaking, what can we look forward to with Mars changing signs? The next topic would be Anaretic degrees. How do we make sense of the fact that Mars is in the last degree of Sagittarius today? What kind of meaning do astrologers assign to the very last degrees of the signs in general, so-called Anaretic degrees? And what are planetary exaltations? When we say Mars is entering its exaltation, what does that really mean, and how does it compare to something, say, like a domicile ruler? So we're going to talk about those things today, and yeah, we'll see what we can learn about each of these little topics. So first of all, let's talk about Anaretic degrees. Anaretic, the word has the ancient roots of the word basically relate back to this idea of a destroyer or a killer. Wow, that's a heavy topic, right? But that gives you a hint as to what astrologers think about the last degrees of the signs in general. The last degrees of the signs are thought of, generally speaking, as malefic. And we can see this when we look at, I'm going to hold this up so you can see it right there. This is called the Table of Planetary Rulerships. This is the Dorothean Table of Planetary Rulerships, which comes from the Hellenistic era of astrology. And there is also a Ptolemaic Table of Planetary Rulerships. They're very similar. They're more similar than dissimilar. The major rulers of the signs, the exaltations, the detriments and falls, pretty much the same face triplicity bound and term rulers in a lot of cases, but there's some differences between these two tables. Nonetheless, though, there's, like I said, there's more in common that the two ancient sort of Greek tables of rulerships have in common. And it's most of the time in modern astrology, there's not a lot of attention that's paid to the language of what are sometimes called essential dignities. That's this sort of the language of this table. How do the planets behave when they enter different kinds of signs, and why? So, but what's interesting is that every sign, I'm going to hold this up so that you can see it. I'm going to bring it in closer. You'll see that there's something called the bound and terms. It's kind of blurry. Sorry. There you go. The bounds and terms. Now, the bounds and terms, they're the same thing. You can call them the bounds or the terms. The bounds or terms are the divisions of every sign into sections of 5. So you have, let's say you take the sign of Libra. The bounds are going to break up the 30 degrees of the sign of Libra into 5 different sections. And there will be a certain number of degrees that are given to each of the 5 sections. They're unequal. They're just different amounts of degrees that are grouped into 5 different chunks. So for example, we turn to Libra here. The first 6 degrees of Libra are ruled by the planet Saturn. From the 6th degree up to the 14th degree, another 8 degrees, ruled by Mercury. From 14 to 21, another 7 degrees, ruled by Jupiter. And then from 21 to 28, another 7 degrees, ruled by Venus. And here's where we get to the magical Anaretic degrees. The last 2 degrees are ruled by Mars, a malefic. Now, when you go through all of the signs, they're all broken into 5 unequal chunks like that, governed each chunk of degrees by a different planet. But Aries, the last 5 degrees, ruled by Saturn. Taurus, the last 3 degrees, ruled by Mars. Gemini, the last 6 degrees, ruled by Saturn. Cancer, the last 4 degrees, ruled by Saturn. Every single sign, the last chunk of degrees, are ruled by either Saturn or Mars, which are classically considered the 2 malefics. Now we have to ask, why were there ever such a thing as malefics to begin with? surely ancient astrologers, ancient mystics who came up with this beautiful system or received it or whatever, they're not sitting there going like, oh yeah, there's some really evil planets up there, and then there's some that are like good. Surely they were more sort of spiritually evolved than that, right? Well, yes, they were. The malefics and benefics throughout the history of astrology are thought of mostly in terms of the symbolic properties of the planet and what it generally relates to in the dual world that we live in, where there are things like hot and cold, wet and dry, good and evil, and things like that. So our symbols these symbols, though they're of a heavenly realm, they're of a different order. They're thought of as gods or the administrators of fate or karma. The planets still have to be able to reflect all of the dualities of human life. And so some of the planets, though they're never so linear as to not, they're all very, very flexible and variegated. They express a wide range of symbolism. But they're 4 planets that are generally talked about in terms of the more pleasing, enjoyable human experiences and those that are less desirable. So for example, Jupiter, which is a planet called the Great Benefic, is associated with things like life, growth, knowledge, virtue, hope, faith, right? Things that are generally thought of as the big noble qualities. But the same exact qualities for thousands of years in Jupiter, depending on Jupiter's context and situation in the chart, could also represent someone who is boastful or arrogant or vain or something like that. Something that grows too big. Okay, so all the planets have always been really well-rounded in that regard, but still Jupiter stands in, generally speaking, as the great benefic, a bringer of things that human beings generally enjoy. Venus, the lesser benefic, is similar. She brings unity, friendship, love, beauty, grace, etc. Oh, the malefics, Saturn is the great malefic, right? We're talking about ignorance, darkness. We're talking about mortality, death, old age, disease, infirmity. We're talking about things with Saturn that are like limit, restriction, the word no, stuff like that. Depression, melancholy. Mars, the lesser benefic or the lesser malefic, is the god of war. So we're talking about strife, contention, division, aggression, violence, discord, misfortune, and things like that. But Mars and Saturn are also both associated with other virtuous qualities like patience for Saturn, or with Saturn for thousands of years, Saturn has also been associated with contemplatives, people who might spend a lot of time alone or in isolation, but perhaps are very close to God. On the other hand, you have Mars, who's not only associated with, generally speaking, Mars is a little bit more difficult. Like Mars is going to more like agitation and inflammation, but Mars is also classically related to bravery. And also, in terms of spiritual things, Mars was related to martyrs, people who died on behalf of something noble or good. So you always have a wide range of flexibility with the language of essential dignities. But it's also important to recognize the consistent way in which Mars does not generally represent things that people love or like. Like most people don't like contention, irritation, inflammation, and things of that nature. So Mars is the lesser malefic, and generally speaking, we also see that Mars is related with certain qualities. The qualities Mars is related with in nature are excessive hotness and dryness. So fire is hot and dry. Mars is like a fiery, hot and dry kind of planet. We prefer to see Mars does much better, for example, in Hellenistic astrology, if you're born during the nighttime, because during the nighttime, Mars is cooled, and so it's not as agitated. Whereas if you're born during the daytime, then we say Mars is what we call the malefic contrary to the sect. So it's daytime when you're born. That means Mars is going to tend to be more excessively hot and fiery. So you have to be, it's kind of a warning to just watch for Mars in your chart as being a little bit more, aggressive or, aggravated. Saturn is the opposite. Saturn is excessively cold and dry. So you want Saturn in a daytime chart, because if you're born during the day, then that means Saturn is in a temperament, in a condition that will warm Saturn up. Whereas if Saturn's in a nighttime chart, then Saturn is the malefic, contrary to the sect. And then Saturn's qualities get to be a little bit more excessively cold. So that's when you have to watch out for the kind of nastier Saturn. All right, so that's a general rule of thumb that Hellenistic astrologers used. But along with that came this idea that the very last degrees of all of the signs were malefic, that the very last degrees, the bound rulers of the very last degrees of every single sign were either Saturn or Mars. Well, this is very similar to the idea of anaretic degrees in astrology, the very last degree, the 29th degree of every sign, right? Same basic idea. It's a killing degree. That sounds really intense, but what it means is like, okay, there's a lot of different things that can die, right? So it's not just killing as in it's like a bad guy in a comic book that's trying to kill the hero. It's not, it's not out to get us. It's a killing degree in the sense that, let's say, things that are whose natural expiration date is up, it's time for them to go. Or it's a time where, the pot that's been on the burner, now it's boiling. There's a kind of a critical mass that's reached at the last degree of every sign. It's very easy when Mars is traveling in the last degree of a sign, as it is today in Sagittarius, which is also a fire sign, very fiery place for Mars. For Mars to be, for us to feel excessive agitation or irritation or anger or a quick temper or fever or inflammation or anything Mars-like, cutting, searing, temperamental, explosive, contentious, confrontational, to cut or divide, to separate things. Sometimes we want to separate things in a good way. For example, let's say that you have, let's say that you have two boys, right? And they're in a classroom, you're a teacher, and these two boys just always getting into trouble. And on that anaretic day, Mars is culminating in the last degree of, Sagittarius. It's an anaretic day. The teacher says, nope, I'm separating you two. I'm done, right? Snip, snip, done. One side of the room, the other side of the room. You guys are troublemakers when you're together. No more. So you separate. So sometimes separating and cutting things is a good thing. We have to separate things out in order to make clear distinctions in our life. We have to separate the good from the bad, the productive from the unproductive. We have to separate the healthy from the unhealthy. But it can also be a day where you can fly off the handle. Let's say you've been repressing how you feel, or you've been allowing a bad habit to linger or something like that. This is a day where, karmically speaking, the bubble might pop. So those are all things that you can think about with Mars in an anaretic degree. And generally speaking, if you have any planets in your chart in anaretic degrees, you can think of them as just a little bit more prone to catharsis. Like a planet in the 29th degree of a sign in your chart, look at that place and just think, okay, whenever that planet gets a transit from another planet, it might be just a little bit more, dynamic. It might pop just a little bit more. So that's something to think about. So the other thing to play with, if you want to, is if you ever pick up a table of the planet, I'll show you again, pick up the table of the planetary rulerships and get to know it. See, here's the bounds. You can also really just look at look at all the planets in your chart and see whose bound the planet is in. And that'll also tell you a very specific, special kind of relationship that one planet has to another planet. And that's actually the same, that's basically how the language of dignities work. In modern astrology, we spend a lot of time talking about aspects, for example. In charts, we spend lots of time talking about what's a trine or a sextile between this planet and that planet. And why do we do that? It's a basic way of getting to know what kinds of topics and themes are connected to one another in the birth chart. Well, the language of essential dignity is very similar in that regard. If you have Jupiter, and you're born with Jupiter in the sign of Capricorn, then you want to know where Saturn is in the chart and what kind of aspect or relationship Jupiter has to Saturn in that chart, because Jupiter is hanging out in Saturn's temple of Capricorn. So the language of dignities, long ago, for thousands of years now, in all different stages of the tradition, essential dignity has been a way of understanding how one planet is relating to another by virtue of being in its temple, or in like a little room within the temple in the case of the bounds and terms that belongs to another planet. So you can kind of think of the temples like this. Let's say you've got Aquarius. Here's a whole temple, 30 degrees. That temple belongs to Saturn. But within it, there are 5 different rooms. And those rooms are like the rental spaces of other deities that like to hang out in that temple. So there's about 3 or 4 degrees and a little room in one part of the temple of Aquarius that belong to Mercury. And that's Mercury's little domain within the temple of Saturn, Aquarius. So it's actually really beautiful to learn all the ways in which the planets can relate to each other in more major or minor kind of tones or keys. And that's part of what it really means to learn the language of essential dignities. There's a lot more we could say about all of that, but we won't, because we want to move along. So that's what you can think about with Mars, culminating today in Sagittarius. Think about a more explosive and dynamic, and perhaps a little bit more a decisive Mars, a bit more courageous, just an amped up Mars for a little bit. Now, for me, on amped up Mars days, I have to be very careful to spend a little extra time being quiet. The main reason for this is that if you get to know every planet and the kind of karmic reactions that every planet tends to elicit, then you can become wiser about how to respond to planetary influences. I'm someone who believes, of course, a great deal in the reality of karma. And so what did ancient yogis tell us about karma? They said, well, there's a certain amount of karma in this lifetime that you're going to have to live through. That's just it. So there's a certain amount of the birth chart that is just non-negotiable. There's just stuff that's going to happen in different areas, different themes. We wouldn't be doing astrology if all of us astrologers on some level didn't believe that some aspect of human life, whether it's psychological or emotional, or whether it's more concrete and literal in terms of events that are going to happen, were not predictable. So similarly, ancient astrologers and philosophers from both the East and the West believe that a certain amount of our lives are destined. They're just, it's a part of the being in the material world as a soul who's made choices and has desires, and there's a web of cause and effect, not all of which we totally understand, that is playing out in this life, and some of it we just can't avoid. So the birth chart tells us a little bit about that. So there is a place and a role for a healthy kind of prediction in astrology in that regard. But ancient traditions also tell us that not everything in life is determined. And so these planetary dynamics that we're seeing in the sky reflect things that are happening down here. But when we study these movements of the planets, we're also trying to teach ourselves how to have a better response to the things that are happening around us, so that our future karma starts to change in a positive direction. So for example, you're not, there might be certain, under a Mars, an Anaretic Mars degree transit, there might be certain things that are destined. It might be your karmic moment to finally blow up and say something and do something, or act out, or cut your finger, or something can happen that's just karma. And we don't exactly know which is which. That's what makes this so hard. But something might happen that's karma. On the other hand, studying astrology, and you know that it's an Anaretic Mars day, you might also take extra time and really, carry a Post-it around with you that says, try to breathe and don't fly into the typical Mars response, reactionary anger or what have you. So there's always a level at which we're participating, and there's always a level at which, in some ways, certain kinds of karma are going to unfold, and that's just that's the lesson that we have to learn. So there's no really negotiating with it. But since we don't know which is which, it's really hard to say exactly what's inevitable and what's not. The best thing that we can do is study the transits, be a participant and observer of the unfolding of fate. So we do the best we can. So that's why I said on an Anaretic Mars day, like, just really try to practice patience and try to make sure that you're not creating another web of complications in your life by how you're responding to the planetary moment. Okay. So I'm not, hold on, Rose has a question. So with what you just said regarding karma, doesn't that make the law of attraction's phrase, ask, believe, receive, a moot point? I'm not totally sure I understand the question, but what I understand from your question would be, is there a role for the law of attraction? And yeah, of course there is, because we're not even from ancient standpoint, people who believed in karma and said there's a certain amount of your life that's predetermined. Even from that standpoint, we also are agents with free will, and we have to use that free will. Now, I think generally speaking, this is just my belief, and as I understand my teachers as well, people take the belief in the law of attraction usually too far, and they don't recognize the degree to which, as an intellectual belief, the law of attraction is meaningless. It's a practice, not an idea, right? So, and it's not an idea that's like think positive thoughts. It's generally, for example, the yogis would say, you can make as many vision boards as you want, unless you're chanting, meditating, in prayer, eating right, sleeping right, you're going to be a prisoner of Maya. You're just going to be caught in reactionary patterns. So it's to me, the law of attraction is very real, but unless it's coming from a very humble space that recognizes the very limited capacity of our will, that where our will is not the summation of everything, then I am afraid that it's a fanciful idea on behalf of a sort of deluded ego. But that's my position, and I very much believe that what we think about and what we dwell upon is part of a chain of cause and effect, right? So if you start with thinking about things that are positive and moving in a positive direction with your thoughts, your lifestyle, your practices, your spiritual practice, and so forth, then yeah, that translates into real results. So I do believe the law of attraction is a real thing, of course. So now going back to Mars at the Anaretic degree, so that's the transition from today into tomorrow. We're going to tomorrow Mars will transition into the sign of Capricorn. So you have this Anaretic degree to think about. Now, what about Mars and Capricorn? Let's talk about that really briefly. So this is Mars's planetary exaltation. Capricorn is the temple in which Mars is exalted. I'll talk more about exaltations in a moment. Let's just talk about, for now, let's give a simple definition of exaltation. Exaltation is where a planet is lifted on high, and it's very powerful and dynamic. However, the exaltation is related to the opposite place, the opposite sign, where it is in its fall or depression. There's a feeling with exaltations of something that burns fast and hot and bright, and that may also fall down. That things that rise quickly also fall down fast. There's that kind of feeling sometimes to exaltations. So when you have Mars in Capricorn, first of all, you have Mars in a place that doesn't allow, because it's a feminine Earth sign and it's Saturn's domain. There's a kind of container for Mars, so that Mars is not nearly as sort of excessively hot and fiery and prone to aggravation and sort of belligerence as Mars might be in other signs. Now, certainly Mars is a little different in every sign, but Mars is very effective and very productive in a feminine Earth sign with Saturn's rulership. It's a disciplined and focused Mars. It's a very hardworking and productive Mars. It's a practical Mars. It's shrewd and can be a little ruthless and opportunistic in Capricorn, but generally speaking, this is a sign that makes Mars a very hard and productive worker, and someone who can exhibit qualities of wisdom, decisiveness, both speed and effectiveness, both an initiating or kind of pioneering and entrepreneurial quality, but also, someone who really separates what's necessary from what's unnecessary. So there's a lot of discrimination and discernment with Mars in Capricorn. There's also a tendency toward experience, maturity, wisdom, as well as toughness. So in terms of getting things done, being productive, it's a very nice place for Mars to be. You have to be very careful always with Mars in its exaltation for there to be a productivity at all costs mentality, workaholism, or that shrewdness, that opportunism that leads to kind of taking advantage of people, or possibly looking at people and everything around you only as an opportunity for the advancement of your own goals. So that kind of selfishness, but it's a very subtle selfishness. It's much more subtle in Capricorn than it is in, say, a fire sign, where it's Mars's sort of selfishness is much more sort of overt. So the kind of selfishness you're more likely to see with Mars and Capricorn is more like, well, what I'm doing is productive and good and valuable, and I need to do it. It's a necessary thing. There's a real feeling of necessity with Mars being in Saturn's sign. And so, it gets a little Machiavellian. Well, the ends justify the means. And that can be subtle, right? Like there can be subtle ways of twisting the truth or manipulating or taking advantage of something or someone, and we do it because we think it's in service to something effective, good, or productive. Be very careful of that, because that kind of thing complexifies our life in the long run. So yeah. The other thing that is very good, Mars in an Earth sign is very good for, is earthy things. So anything related to land or growing or building or construction. If you're going to do remodeling, or if you have you're going to clean out your attic, you need to be very decisive in purging something or cleaning out. So very good energy and sense for spring cleaning right now. It's a really nice time for that kind of stuff. And Mars in Capricorn also, you can think of also as the sort of the prototypical, like, I'm in DC, right? I live in DC, so there's a lot of this around here. This, like, people who are like government workers or politicians, they're hyper productive and disciplined, and their whole life is running according to like the Google Calendar, and they have like notifications going off and all different kinds of apps when there has to be that kind of just like that super sort of type A steamroll through life, but do it in a way that doesn't appear sort of frantic and all over the place. Very collected, cool, composed, and yet there's a shark underneath, Mars in Capricorn. So these are just things, hopefully, that help you get in the mood. Best thing to do is to look and see what house is Mars entering, what whole sign house is Mars entering. You're going to feel a sense of hard work, productivity, go get it, and you want to be very careful about a little bit subtler version of ego, arrogance, vanity, me, coming into that particular area of your life. Subtle because at the end of the day, it's so much easier to be vain or arrogant when we're like, well, what I'm doing is so important. What I'm doing is it's so productive. This is good. You need me to do it. I need to do it. So you see that the need and the ends will end up justifying the means. So be careful of that. All right, last but not least, planetary exaltations. What are they? How do they work? And how can you think about them? Because sometimes you'll hear about, oh, Mars is exalted in Capricorn. There's a great Hellenistic text. I mean, it's not like light reading, but Rhetorius the Egyptian astrological compendium containing his explanation and narration of the whole art of astrology. This is a translation from James Holden, but I want to just, a lot of times people think, I understand why. They're like, this is ancient old language, it's not, like, we don't need all of these rulers and this, and the language kind of, you bristle at it, especially things like rulers and exaltation and stuff like that, because we live in a day and age where there's only one thing that's exalted, and that's me and my sense of freedom and choice. Don't impinge on me. Don't talk to me about rulers. Don't talk to me about exalting anything, right? No. It's I have my Bachelor of Fine Arts in everything about personal liberty and choice. And there's like, right? And there's something that's really good about that, obviously. There's we don't want to walk around with we don't need a monarch right now. But it's very important to not just dismiss this ancient language, because the language of dignities, regardless of how we care for the actual wording or not, the semantics, carries a very deep and relevant set of meanings for our practice. So we have to understand them. All right, so we have exaltations and falls. Here's what Rhetorius said. Having said then all the physical mixtures of the signs, we will come to the causes of the exaltations and falls and the opposites of the stars. That's the domiciles and detriments. So there's exaltations and falls, and then there's domicile or rulers and detriments or exiles. These are two sets of opposites that exist in the language of essential dignities. Okay, here we go. For what reason is the sun exalted here, Saturn in its fall there? So now we're talking about the sun being exalted in Aries, and Saturn is in its fall in Aries, whereas Saturn is exalted in Libra and the sun is in its fall in Libra. He says, why is it like this? Well, we say that the sun is the storehouse of fire and light and the lord of the day, but Saturn, on the other hand, is cold, signifying darkness. Here, then, in Aries is exalted the light of day. There is in Libra is in its fall the darkness and the night, and the cold is warmed. And here in Libra, the darkness, Saturn, is exalted, and there in Aries, in the light, is in its fall, and the day becomes shorter. So what he's explaining in this instant is he's explaining the reasoning behind exaltation. So why is it that the sun is exalted in Aries, but in its fall or depression in Libra, whereas Saturn is exalted in Libra, but in its fall or depression in Aries? And he says it's because at that time of year, the days are getting longer. They will become longer than they are shorter. The light half of the year is taking over, in other words. In terms of the yin and yang and the relationship between the yin and yang in the I Ching, there's a specific hexagram where we see the spring equinox and the light half of the year taking over, and it's a time where yang starts to predominate over yin. So in the solar year, when yang predominates over yin, that's where we say the sun is exalted. It's in an extra powerful sort of intense position. Whereas when we put the sun in Libra, the fall equinox, when the darkness is taking over or yin is rising and yang is dropping, then we say the sun is in its fall. This is literally why we say the fall is, this is why we use the word fall for the autumn. We also have Saturn, on the other hand, exalted in Libra. Why? Because Saturn is the lord of darkness. There's a lot of virtue and esoteric stuff in the darkness, so it's not just bad. But Saturn is exalted in Libra, where the darkness is taking over, whereas it's in its fall in Aries, where the light is taking over. All of the exaltations and depressions work like this. There's a very beautiful logic at play in all of them, and he goes through all of them in this section, which I won't do, but that's the basic idea. So what about Capricorn and Mars? Well, Mars is in its exaltation in Capricorn and in its fall in Cancer, the opposite sign. And the reason for this is that Mars, as a planet that was traditionally associated with death, is exalted during the time of maximal darkness, the winter solstice, Capricorn, whereas it is associated at the summer solstice, where there's the maximal amount of light. Mars is in its fall because Mars is not as much about light as it is about dark. Now, the reason that it's about dark primarily is because it has to do, again, with separating, cutting, and dividing things. Okay, so what about the exaltations in those same signs? The opposite planet that works with Mars. Well, it's Jupiter. So Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Why? Because Jupiter is the maximal planet of life and the proliferation of life. So its exaltation is at the summer solstice of Cancer, when there's a maximal amount of light in the 24-hour day, and it's a proliferation of lifetime in the summer. Whereas Jupiter is in its fall in Capricorn, where there's a maximal amount of darkness. And so we have a very elaborate, again, like logic behind planetary exaltations. So when you think about Mars in Capricorn, in a cold earth sign, maximal darkness time of year in Capricorn, this is why Mars is exalted here. It's very effective. It's although it's a hot and sort of dry, fiery planet, it also is generally associated with death. And so we have a planet taking place in a Saturn-ruled sign. It's cold, dry, earthy, and it makes Mars very effective, not nearly the sort of bombastic. Like if you think of a bombastic Mars, you think of Donald Trump's Mars. He has Mars right on the ascendant in his chart in Leo. Fiery, super just fiery, bombastic. Mars in Capricorn, not nearly like that. I'm trying to think. I should have looked up a famous Mars in Capricorn. Here, let me see if I can find one. Who has Mars in Capricorn? I can't think of anyone off the top of my head, so I'll just look. Oh, okay, here's some. Let's see if I can find a good one. Albert Einstein. There's a pretty good one. So you think about Albert Einstein, and you have a good. Did I get that right? Let me just make sure that that's right. I think so. Yeah, Mars, and is it an anaretic degree? Is that even? No, it's not. It's not quite well. Yeah, it's actually in the anaretic last degrees. So it's that's a perfect example of not only a very potent Mars in a famous person's chart, but it's an anaretic Mars as well. So there's that super hardworking, productive, Mars in an accomplished scientist chart like Albert Einstein. So at any rate, there's a lot more that could be said, but there's one more thing I want to say about planetary exaltations. It's kind of fun. Another way of thinking about planetary exaltations when you're looking at your chart is to think about them like the CEO of a sign, right? As this is kind of funny analogy, but like, okay, so let's say Capricorn in your chart, the ruler is Saturn. So let's say it's a restaurant. Saturn is going to be like the manager of the restaurant of that temple. Okay, it's Capricorn is the restaurant, and the manager is Saturn. The CEO, the CEO is usually not there, right? They're not as familiar with the place as the manager is, who's there day in, day out, week in, week out. But they own the place. The actual owner, let's say, not even CEO, let's just call it the owner. The owner of that temple is the exaltation lord. So Saturn is the manager of the place, but Mars is the exaltation lord. Mars is the actual owner. So you can also look at Capricorn in your chart, for example, and say, okay, so another planet that I can look to in terms of a relationship to ninth house topics. Like let's say you have Capricorn. Yeah, let's say you have Capricorn in the ninth, place of higher truth, religion, long journeys abroad, things like that, academics. So let's say, Saturn's going to tell you a lot about your relationship to those topics by looking at Saturn's placement in your birth chart. But you could also look to Mars, the exaltation lord, and Mars will also tell you a great deal about ninth house topics. And that's something that really changed my practice when I first started working with it, because it was not something that I was used to doing. But you can pay attention to exaltation lords of the houses as well. For example, and look at the whole sign house of Cancer, And instead of just looking at the moon, which will give you a lot of information about the topics of that house. So let's say your third house is Cancer. You might want to look at the moon in order to get a little bit more information about siblings and maybe other things. But the Jupiter, the exaltation lord of Cancer, will also tell you something about that sign. So that's a little bit about exaltation lords. Okay, so we had we covered everything that I wanted to cover: Mars entering Capricorn, Anaretic degrees, and planetary exaltations. Some questions here. Would you say that Mars' malefic, excessively hot qualities are mitigated by being in an extremely cold Saturn-ruled sign? Yeah, that's something I think I said a few times today. Definitely. You're born, again, if you're born during the nighttime, Mars is going to be generally less sort of belligerent in your chart. Well, but if you're born during the daytime, Mars tends to be a little bit more, combative. Another thing that can mitigate that, however, though, is if you have Mars in a daytime chart, but it's in, say, Capricorn, it's exalted, and it's in an earthy, cold, dry sign, you can deal with that Mars a lot more than, someone like Donald Trump, who has a daytime chart. So Mars is going to be excessively hot and fiery. He has Mars in a fire sign right on the ascendant. Like, the guy can't help but just be kind of a bully. That's just like, we go back to the whole thing about what is destined and what karmically, and how we can train ourselves to have different responses and reactions. Probably Trump is destined to be the way he is on some level, but we could also say that he might need the Post-it note with him on an Anaretic Mars day. You know what I mean? Like, that's like every day for him. So let's just, maybe even a tattoo. I don't know. So at any rate, Sue asks, when Saturn transits your Mars in Capricorn, is this more likely to offer benefits even though they are both malefics? Yes. You have to look at, of course, if it's a daytime or nighttime chart, right? And what house it's in. Like, if it's in the 12th house, that's going to be difficult, more on the difficult side. If it's in the 6th house, more on the difficult side. It depends on which house it's going through as well. Not all houses are built equally, and that, not all houses develop topics that are, same or different. So that, you have to understand the topics of the house as well. Okay, so I think that is, but also look at the topics of the whole sign house in general. All right, so that's where we're going to stop for today. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I hope you all have a wonderful Friday, and we will see you. Have a nice new moon tomorrow. That's another thing to remember. New moon in Pisces. So enjoy the dark moon today, and in the start of a new moon cycle tomorrow. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.